welcome to Crime in Court. This is the 1996 Menendez brothers trial. We are reading through the transcript of California versus Erik and Lyle Menendez on trial for the homicides of their parents, Kitty and Jose. And we are finally on the defense's case. This is part 19. And it took us a while because the state's case was long enough on its own, and the defense's case is going to be pretty long too. So we're buckling up and getting ready for the ride because it's just begun for the defense's case, anyways. So let's get started here. Right where we left off. Please hit the like button if you haven't done so already. We are picking up where we left off last time. It is still Ron Linhart, criminalist, on the stand, and he is on. Oh my gosh, I don't remember now, and I just did the recording not that long ago. He's on redirect. Sorry, he's on redirect, I believe, unless that was concluded. I'm not sure. We'll figure it out. Come on. Let's get started here. Okay, so the court says everybody is present. We'll have the jury out. Please, the jury enters the courtroom and the following proceedings were held. The court says, all right, we'll resume with the redirect. I was right. Okay. Um, Ms. Abramson says, thank you. So redirect examination. Okay, sorry. Redirect examination begins, and Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Linhart, calling your attention to the photograph on the board. Mr. Khan posited a hypothetical to you concerning now at least some. Just check the number again. Sorry, 331. Continuing. The notion that the smear at the front of the cushions. So, what was the question? Mr. Linhart, calling your attention to the photograph on the board, Mr. Khan posited a hypothetical to you concerning the notion that the smear at the front of the cushions could have occurred after Mrs. Menendez was shot by her raising her leg and brushing it against the couch. Do you recall that hypothetical? Yes, I do. In addition, he offered a hypothetical having to do with her hand touching the top of the couch. Are you aware of any injuries that she suffered to her left hand? My recollection is that it was the right hand that was injured. I don't recall an injury to the left hand. And if the right hand were injured, you would expect, would you not, bleeding from the right hand, correct? That portion, yes, the hand would be bleeding following the injury. Were you aware or do you recall from your review of the photographs an area of blood smearing and blood dropping on the coffee table directly in front of where Mrs. Menendez's torso is shown in these photographs? Yes, I do. And is the presence, was it smears and drops both? There was a combination of both projected blood drops and smeared contact transfers. And those contact transfers, would they be consistent with her touching that coffee table with her right hand? That is a possibility. And the drops, were they consistent with the drops falling straight down or drops coming across at an angle, if you recall? My recollection is that there were, at least some of the drops were projected and approached the table at an angle. Would that be consistent with someone standing next to the table and receiving a wound to the portion of their body that directly will strike that? Would that be consistent with someone standing between the couch and the table, facing towards the table, when that person is struck in the front of their body, if the front of their body is contiguous with the table or next to the table? I would have to relook at that photograph. My recollection is that that is most probably not blood that is directly from a shotgun impact, but probably applied subsequently. I couldn't get that word out, but applied subsequently due to other motion of a bleeding area. So, like a bleeding hand held over? or moved over it, or some other part of the body or other object that had blood on it being moved sufficiently to project relatively large blood droplets. You recall Mr. Kahn also posited to you a hypothetical based on one of these illustrations. I think it was this one. No, it was number 9. Let me get it 9 out. I think Mr. Khan showed you 9 in order to ask a question about whether if Mrs. Menendez received a wound, as demonstrated there, with a trajectory close to the floor that goes through the left leg of this illustration, dummy, and deposits blood on the floor, and if she then moves her left foot in such a way as to put the flat of the foot over the blood, could that have caused blood smears to appear on the bottom of her shoe? Do you recall basically what was the hypothetical Mr. Khan asked you? Yes, I do. In looking at the real photograph of the area near her left shoe, is there any bloody shoe print in that area? I saw something that I could identify specifically as a bloody shoe print in that area or any other. I saw nothing. Sorry, I saw nothing that I could identify specifically as a bloody shoe print or any in that area or any other area. So she probably didn't take steps after that. So there are no bloody shoe prints per se anywhere. Not that I could find. No. So, if, for example, Mrs. Menendez was standing, let's say, do you recognize this? By the way, what I'm pointing to is the area of the coffee table where the smears are. Yes, I do. And if she were, for example, standing in front of that area and received a number of wounds and then stepped, okay, in that same area and picked up the blood on the bottom of her shoe and subsequently was down, her body was down in that area and bleeding over where she had stepped, would you not expect to see any bloody prints? Oh, that's an interesting take. That she did step down on the carpet before and left a bloody shoe print, but a blood pool from other wounds have effectively covered it up. It's an interesting theory. I could I could see some possible potential to that. All right, so that's certainly a possible mechanism for obscuring a bloody shoe print once it had been deposited. That's possible. So there you go. You notice in 331, the photograph you were looking at, which showed this area of blood dripping in her ankle, and on the top of her left shoe, you notice her right foot is shown straight. Did you note that detail? Yes, I did. And is it your understanding that that is not the position in which her body was found by police? Yes. Based upon my having observed other photographs, I'm aware that the leg has been moved by the time that photograph was taken. And is it your recollection that the right leg was, at the time the police came, underneath the coffee table, supported by the shelf that runs that full length of the coffee table? Yes, I noted that when I evaluated the photographs. Showing you what's previously been marked 7, Exhibit 7 in this case, does that photograph show the right foot protruding between the shelf of the coffee table and the top of the coffee table? Yes, it does. From that photograph, can you see that there is blood smearing on that shoe as well? Yes, that blood is apparent in this photograph. And based on the hypothetical Mr. Khan gave you, do you see that even in this illustration 9b, the suggestion is made that the right foot, the right limb of the dummy, is underneath the table? In that simulation, yes, I see it. Certainly, this simulation doesn't account and couldn't account for getting blood on the bottom of the right shoe. Objection leading. Is that right? Overruled. The blood on the shoe definitely was not deposited on the shoe while the leg was in that position. And it doesn't explain how the blood on the right shoe could have gotten there, does it? That simulation does not, no. Now, over the course of your criminalist career, both at the coroner's office and at the sheriff's department, have you worked on cases where it is necessary for you to form an opinion as to whether certain wounds were postmortem, or perimortem? I have worked on cases where I've made observations and have had such opinions. I've never been in a position where I had to rely solely upon my own opinion for conclusions. Well, isn't that telling? Because as we know, Dr. McCarthy made his own, he came up with his own opinions. He even read the doctor's opinion, discounted it, and said, no, I'm going to take the opposite view. This guy is a criminalist. He's very, very knowledgeable in a lot of things, and he knows when to say that's not my opinion. Like it's not up to me to make that conclusion, basically. So you have always been able to either consult with or rely upon opinions of forensic pathologists to support your conclusions, correct? I've always made it a point to do that, yes. Are you aware that in the amendment to his 1995, we'll strike that. In the 1995 amendment to his autopsy protocol concerning Mrs. Menendez, Dr. Golden indicates that the contact wound to her left cheek was either perimortem or postmortem. Objection calls for hearsay. Ms. Abrams says, talking about Dr. Golden. Mr. Khan says, which he didn't read. The court says he said he didn't read it. So are you asking him to assume something or what are you asking? Ms. Abramson says, we have in fact discussed this point, Mr. Linhart, that you were aware that that was a change that was made in the autopsy. Objection leading, no foundation. Court says, well, he's testified about it in general. Ms. Abramson says, I'll make it a hypothetical if that's easier, Your Honor. Hypothetically, I'd like you to assume that on September 25th, 1995, Dr. Golden wrote an amendment. We know that he did. So it's not an assumption, but we're hypothetically assuming this. And concerning Mrs. Menendez, so this new autopsy amendment on his autopsy protocol concerning Mrs. Menendez, in which he changed his original opinion that the contact wound to her left cheek was antemortem to the opinion that it was either perimortem or postmortem. Assume that hypothetical. Yes. Does that opinion, perimortem or postmortem, confirm an opinion that you previously had about that wound? Objection, no foundation, calls for speculation. Overruled. Yes, it does. And was your opinion, even prior to that amendment, that that wound was more likely postmortem than antemortem? Antemortem is before, perimortem is in the process of dying, postmortem is after death. Objection calls for speculation. Well, it doesn't call for speculation for him to say what his opinion was. No foundation. It's certainly leading as phrased. Ms. Amerson says, I'm sorry, could you tell us what your opinion was of that wound from the time that you were observing the photograph back in 1993? Objection, no foundation, he's not a doctor. Overruled. I mean, are we trying to get to the truth here or we just want to keep his answers out? I don't know, whatever. The witness says, at the time that I first examined these photographs, the surface appearance of that wound appeared to me as a postmortem wound. And one final thing, you've indicated that because of the blood pooling pattern and flow pattern that you see on that right cushion of the sofa, you believe that Mr. Menendez at some point his body might have been leaning more to the right than in its final resting position, correct? That is correct. And you indicate that his body may have shifted back into that position as the result of the couch being bumped. And that is one possible mechanism for shifting his body. Calling your attention to photograph 331, can you discern in that photograph that Mrs. Menendez's back is straight up against that couch? I think she meant Mr. Menendez, or maybe the clerk wrote it wrong. Not clerk, but you know who I mean. The person who does the transcripts. All right, so he says 331 being the one in the upper left-hand corner. Yes, that's correct. So Mr. Menendez is sitting on the couch, so that's why I'm asking, can you discern in that photograph Mrs. Menendez's back is right up against the couch? Maybe it is Mrs. Menendez. Maybe the way she's laying, her back's up against the couch, and then her feet are intertwined in the coffee table. He says that's correct. And let me ask you a hypothetical. If Mrs. Menendez, okay, so we are talking about Mrs. You never can tell because there's always errors in these things. If Mrs. Menendez fell to the floor and rolled her back rolled into that couch, could that be the type of bump that you had in mind that could have then shifted Mr. Menendez's body slightly back? Objection leading and argumentative. Leading and what? Argumentative. Overrule. You may answer the question. The witness says, yes, that I consider a possible source of the action that shifted Mr. Menendez's position. So, Kitty, her back hitting the back of the couch could have jerked Mr. Menendez back to the final position where he was. She says, thank you, Mr. Linhart. I have nothing further. The court says, any recross, and we do. Sir, are you commonly called upon to testify about whether wounds are ante-mortem or post-mortem? No, I'm not. Have you ever done that before in court? I may have. I don't recall. As far as you can recall, this is the first time you've ever offered such an opinion. I have offered that opinion in consultation with detectives and attorneys on many occasions. I don't recall whether I've been asked to testify in court on that. So it's not that he can't give an opinion, it's just that he have never testified to it in court. So you can't think of a single instance in which you've ever given under oath testimony as to whether a wound was ante-mortem or post-mortem. I don't recall. How do you normally go about making a determination as to whether a wound is ante-mortem or post-mortem? For purposes of my foundation, for my reconstructions, when I require that information, I obtain that from the autopsy protocol or consultation with the pathologist. Okay. Now, what do you ever, do you ever reach your own personal conclusions without consultation with the pathologist as to whether a wound is ante-mortem or post-mortem? I will reach conclusions based on the limits of my knowledge. As far as applying that to foundation for a formal opinion reconstructing the event, I will rely upon the ultimate determination for the forensic pathologist. Now, you read the Dr. Golden's report of 1989 concerning the autopsy that he performed upon Kitty Menendez. Is that correct? Yes, I did. And you were aware from that autopsy report that he said that the wound to Kitty's left cheek was an ante-mortem wound. Is that correct? That was my reading of his autopsy protocol, yes. And are you also aware of the fact that the way by which it is determined whether a wound is ante-mortem or post-mortem is not so much by looking at a photograph, but by looking to the wound to see whether there is hemorrhaging to the wound? Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Court says, as phrased, it is argumentative. Mr. Khan says, okay. In reviewing the conclusion of Dr. Golden in his 1989 report, that was an ante-mortem wound. Did you consider the statement of Dr. Golden in that report that there was hemorrhaging into the wound? Objection, Your Honor. Misstates the report. Overruled. The witness says, I don't have detailed enough recollection of the words used in the report to recall his saying that. I would have to read it again at this point to determine the words he used. I have a copy. Mr. Khan says, do you have a copy of the report with you? Yes, I have it in my file. If you could take out your copy of the report, the witness does so. Okay, if I could direct your attention to page 2 of that report. Ms. Abramson says page 2. Mr. Khan says, under description of the shotgun wounds. Do you recall Dr. Golden indicating in that report that all the injuries described are ante-mortem unless otherwise specified? Yes, I had recalled his using those words. I see them there now. And as you read the description of that particular wound, which is wound number 1, did you see any indication in the description of that wound that is not antemortem? No, he did not say that it was not antemortem. In other words, he provided no exception to the general statement that all wounds are antemortem unless otherwise specified. Now, your conclusion that Jose Menendez was likely standing at the time that he received the wound to his left leg is based upon the fact that you failed to observe any blowout alongside of the couch. Is that correct? It's based in part upon that determination, yes. What else is it based upon? It's based upon the absence of that blowout elsewhere and or in that area. Therefore, it must have been in some other location based upon that fact he had to have been turned to some other orientation. It's also based in part on my potential finding a possible spot for that on the couch cushion. And you haven't testified here in court to a photograph which depicts that blowout that you're referring to? Yes, I pointed it out earlier, and I don't know the number of the photograph, but on the easel, it's the one in the lower right corner. Is this the photograph that you're referring to here? Are you referring to something that you can see while he's still in the seated position? Yes, I am. Let me show you 230. If you can tell us what you're referring to in that photograph as being potential blowout. There are some droplets on the front and up of the top right at the front edge of the photograph that could be part of an exit spatter pattern. Okay, and what you're looking at there is just a very few droplets. There are a few. That's not adequate to account for the entire exit spatter. That's why I'm unable to conclude that it's, in fact, what it is. He says it has the potential to be, but it's not necessarily uh, a full pattern that he can decisively say. Right above those few droplets, there's what appears to be a fairly clean space there. There's not much blood in the area immediately above this. There are some areas where there is no blood droplets. It's a fairly small amount, or small area. Is it your opinion that the blowout in this case would have just caused a few droplets there and the rest of the blowout would have gone above it and on the seat and where we can't see it? Yes, that is in fact part of that pattern would be on the seat in an area subsequently obscured by additional bleeding. The fact of that subsequent possibility of obscuring it makes it impossible for me to determine definitively that it's in fact what it is. Aside from definitively, you have no basis upon which you can look at that photograph and say that's blowout, is there? Objection, argumentative. The court asks, did you understand the question? Yes, I did. Regarding argumentative, objection overruled, says the court. The witness says, yeah, that is true. I cannot definitively identify that as exit spatter. It just provides me one possibility. It provides you with one theory about without any substantiation. Objection. The witness says, well, no. Objection argumentative overruled. The witness says, no, it is not without any substantiation. There's some evidence for that being the case based upon the appearance of the spatter in that region. The absence of the spatter, which necessarily occurred in any other region, makes that the most likely of the possibilities that I can identify as I testified. But I cannot conclude that that's necessarily the case, and I don't mean at this point to imply that. And once the body was removed from that position, were there photographs which indicated to you, looking at the place where he was seated, that there was blowout there? There were photographs taken of the seat which showed the pool that had pooled underneath him, and unfortunately, it is impossible to determine whether or not there was blood drops initially that were subsequently obscured by that pooling of blood under his body. That's the reason the conclusion remains inconclusive. Like, how many times I gotta tell you, I can't tell from the scene. So we have no physical evidence from looking at where he was actually seated, which supports the theory that he was standing at the time that he was shot as fired. Is that correct? That's not correct. We have some evidence, but insufficient to conclude conclusively that that was the orientation when the shot was fired. I'm talking about from where he was seated. I'm not talking about those few blood drops in front that you already told us about. I'm just talking about from where he was actually seated. There is no physical evidence which supports the theory that he was standing at the time that the shot was fired to his leg, is there? There's no other spatter visible in that area that was subsequently obscured by the flow of blood. No, I wouldn't expect to be able to determine that. Is your opinion that what happened in this case that he was standing with his left leg near the side of the couch, that he was then shot in the inside of the left leg, there was spatter which came out to the left side of his leg, and that he turned around on that weakened leg and sat down sat down in this comfortable position? Objection, Your Honor. Assumes facts, not an evidence. The court says, well, removing the description of comfortable with it, you can answer the question. The witness says, there are other answers of the scenario that you described that I cannot conclude. I can't conclude, for example, that his weight was resting on the injured leg at the time that he was shot. And in fact, as I previously stated, I can't conclude, in fact, that that was the orientation he was in when the shot was fired to his leg. What I stated is that that is one of the possibilities, and actually the most likely possibility that I could find based upon the absence of any evidence of the exit spatter in any other location that I could see, and some spatter in that location that could reasonably be exit spatter, that would suggest that that is a possibility. So, beyond that, I cannot further describe his position in a subsequent movement. He could not have placed borne weight on that leg based upon the coroner's description of the fractured femur following that, but I don't know that the weight was on the leg at the time that the wound was received. But the blood spatter could suggest, like, you have to piece everything together. You can't just look at one thing at a time. So you can't tell if he was standing on the femur, but you also have blood that dripped straight down from above, which could be either from his arm or a leg wound, and that means that, he was standing if it came from up to down straight. There were blood drops that didn't have an angular, pattern to them, so it looked like they went from top to bottom, up to down. And this theory of yours that he was shot in the left leg and that there is no blowout also fails to take into account in any way that piece of tissue that was found here in the entry into the den. Is that correct? You've misstated my opinion that there was no blowout, as you put it, or exit spatter from that wound. I don't believe that to be the case. No. That possible scenario that I provided, what I referred to as the most probable based upon the evidence that I saw, does not account for what has been described as tissue in another part of the room. Well, one of the criticisms that you had of Mr. McCarthy's testimony was that he ignored some physical evidence in this case. Is that correct? Yes, I firmly believe that he did. Can you tell us how you account for that piece of tissue over by the door? I don't know that it is tissue. It was an object that appeared in the photograph, that front photograph that I said I could not identify. I am confident that it is not a direct result of the exit spatter from that wound because none of the other features of an exit spatter are present, even if it is a piece of tissue. So now I did not ignore that as a piece of evidence indicating that that was a portion of the exit spatter. It is an unknown object in another portion of the room. I cannot use it further for my reconstruction because I don't know what it is. And because your guys didn't test it, We definitely don't. We can't confirm that it was tissue. It's just something that appears in a photograph. And we're supposed to take your word for it that it's tissue when there's no other blood spatter patterns or anything around it. It's just a little dishonest. Well, when you tell us all that all the wounds took place to Kitty right about that area where she is found, and when you also tell us that shots to Jose Menendez took place as you indicated, your account of this shooting ignores that piece of physical evidence, doesn't it? Objection, argumentative, overruled. No, I have not identified that as an item that is, in fact, evidence. I don't know what it is. As far as that providing potential evidence that one of them was in that area of the room when they were shot, if that's what you mean to suggest by that question, I think there is other contradicting evidence to that scenario in that the area between that object, whatever it is, and the bodies is totally free of any blood trail that would suggest anyone injured and bleeding sufficient to drip blood was moving across that area of the floor. So it lacks any supporting evidence that it is tissue. There's nothing around it to provide any kind of forensic evidence that would be consistent with blowout, which is what they're trying to say that it is. So, what it is and how it got there, I do not know, but it does not provide evidence due to the surrounding features that someone was in that region when he or she was shot. Getting back to what I asked you a moment ago about your opinion concerning the wounds of the left cheek of Kitty Menendez and being possibly perimortem or postmortem, did you also read the part of the report of Dr. Golden directing your attention to page 3, which indicated in that third paragraph from the bottom, the last line, Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I'm going to object to counsel reading selected parts out of context. Overruled. Wow. Okay. You can just read whatever selected text you want out of context. Did you read that last line, which says there is hemorrhaging along the entire wound path as described, and in the case of gunshot wound number 1, dark blood or dark black soot deposited mixed with bone fragments? Yes, I read that. Did you understand that the fact there was hemorrhaging along the entire wound path is the most reliable indicator that that was, in fact, an antemortem wound? Your Honor, I'm going to object to that statement as being argumentative. It's misleading. Overruled. This is cross examination. The witness can respond. The witness says, Yes, I understand the observation of wound hemorrhaging and blood in the tissue is a part of the determination of whether a wound is antemortem or postmortem. What I testified to was it was my opinion, based upon just an observation of the surface of the wound, that it appeared to be postmortem wound to me. As I stated, I understand that is not a complete evaluation of the wound and did not rely upon conclusion for any subsequent reconstruction. So he didn't rely on that conclusion for anything, and he, he disagreed with the person who did the autopsy, the pathologist who did the autopsy. But even the forensic pathologist agreed with himself because in 95 he changes his opinion on that. So his first initial opinion is that it happened after death, but then or before. What is anti? Now I'm confusing myself. Post-mortem after, perimortem during, anti is before. So they're trying to say that it happened before, and now even the what is the forensic pathologist? I'm like losing my words here. Even the forensic pathologist who did the autopsy changed his own opinion about that wound and said later it was peri or postmortem. This is a big deal because, I mean, if you're trying to reconstruct something and you don't have, the forensic pathologist who did the autopsy is even second guessing himself, how can you tell and how can you rely on any of it? You know what I'm saying? So it's a quandary. All right, Mr. Khan says, well, assuming that there was hemorrhaging along the entire wound path, don't you think that it is assuming that a pathologist observed hemorrhaging along the entire wound path? Don't you think that that is a more reliable indicator as to whether or not this was an antemortem wound than you, a criminalist, simply looking at a photograph? Very insulting. But yeah, he says if that were the final conclusion, I would have to agree that there's much more than my looking at the surface of the wound to determine that. I merely stated, upon being asked what my impression, my conclusion was based on the observation of the photos of the skin surface. Now, you said that in regard to well, let's go to the photograph here of Jose Menendez 183, which shows that wound to his left arm. Counsel asked you if you were aware of the fact that in that wound, in that photograph, the wound was already been partially dissected. Is that correct? Yes. That was the appearance of being a wound that has been cut open. So it was the appearance of being cut open. Are you aware of the fact from Dr. Golden's report that that wound right there was 6 inches by 4 inches in size before the dissection? I don't have that memorized. I could refer to the autopsy report to see what dimensions he described for it. Well, do you have a copy of that report before you? Yes, I do. This witness is prepared. Let me direct your attention to the 89 report of Jose Menendez. Page 6, the full paragraph, first sentence. Do you recall upon reading that paragraph that Dr. Colden said that that wound was 6 inches by 4 inches? Objection, that misstates the report. The court says, why don't you read the specific words? Uh-huh. Do you recall Dr. Golden writing in his report, quote, also confirming distal proximal is an exit laceration on the medial aspect of the right upper arm adjacent to the axilla, measuring approximately 6 by 4 inches and located approximately 9 to 14 inches below the top of the right shoulder. This appears to be related to one of the shotgun wounds of the right upper extremity, either 2 or 3. Likewise, confirming that the trajectory is distal, proximal, and lateral media. Yes, I recall that description. Do you think the jury knows what the hell that means? I didn't understand it. Do you recall that wound we're talking about there is 6 inches by 4 inches in size? Is that correct? He described it as such, yes. And even though he described a wound to his right arm as 6 inches by 4 inches in size, you still don't feel that the blood from that wound could account for the blood that seeped down in between those two cushions. Is that correct? Yes. Based upon the totality of my observations, I still believe that that was predominantly from the head wound. Let's move on to something else. You didn't give me the answer I want. Let's switch topics. Showing you 319 now, directing your attention once again to those contact, if I may have just a moment, directing your attention to what you refer to as contact smears. Their Counsel pointed out to you just a short while ago that it was Kitty's right hand and that had been badly injured in this incident rather than her left hand. Is that correct? I do recall a description of injuries to the right hand. I don't recall any to the left. Were you saying just a little while ago that because the injury to the right hand was to the right hand rather than the left, that before Kitty Menendez could not have made any of these marks on the sofa with her left hand? No, I wasn't asked the question to which I could respond regarding that. Okay. And in fact, Kitty's the left hand of Miss Aronson says, Your Honor, I'm going to object to the way counsel is characterizing the decedents. Court says, all right, he was about to do otherwise, so you may proceed. In fact, the left hand of Kitty Menendez was, in fact, had a great deal of blood on it, didn't it? There is blood on her left hand, as shown in the photographs of her at the scene. Well, let me show you 96 for identification. Is that one of the photographs that depicts her at the time that she was discovered? Yes. Okay, and does that show, in fact, that there is a great deal of blood, that there's a great deal of blood on the back of her left hand and her left arm? Yes, there is blood on her left hand and her left arm. I just want to point out that the state is doing a great job at really honing in these crime scene photos and making the jury have to look at them, have to repeatedly look at horrific, gory crime scenes, which can ultimately affect them emotionally and make them start to take it out against the defendants. It's very possible that they could have been just totally inundated with crime scene photos, and it made them think, well, we need to punish the brothers for this. So I just wanted to point that out because we're on whatever month. I think we're only on the second month of trial, and there's still a long ways to go. This is a 6-month trial. We're done. We're just about done with the second month. This is November 30th, so we're about to move on to December, which is our third month of trial. And we've had a great deal of crime scene photos being discussed, testimony about them, and having to refer back to the photos repeatedly. So I just wonder if that had anything to do with their guilty verdicts. All right, moving on. Okay, and does that show, in fact, that there is a great deal of blood, that there's a great deal of blood on the back of her left hand and her left arm? Yes, there is blood on her left hand and her left arm. And because this was such a bloody crime scene, all of the stains on that couch, well, in particular, I'm referring to the stain on the top of the cushion, could have been caused by her left hand touching that, even though her left hand had not been injured. Isn't that correct? Objection argumentative. Overruled. I would consider that within the realm of possibility. If the left hand had been contaminated with blood, then that provides a possible source of transfer of blood to the couch. And you know that at some time during this shooting, her hand was in fact contaminated because by the time her body was found, she's bloody all over, including her left hand and arm. Is that correct? Objection argumentative. As phrased, it's argumentative. Objection sustained. Is it correct that at the time her body was found, her left hand and her left arm was bloody? Yes. Now, counsel asked you if it was possible that Kitty Menendez received many of the wounds to her body while she was standing up, and you agreed that she could have. Is that correct? That's correct. That's within the realm of possibility. Do you think that she could have received all the wounds to her legs while she was standing up and remained standing? Objection compound, Your Honor, overruled. I don't know that I can conclude that she could have remained standing. I would have to review the autopsy protocol to see how seriously the injury was to the leg to offer an option as at this point whether she could have remained standing after receiving the leg wounds. Well, did you look at the x-rays in this case to get an idea of how severe the wounds to the legs were? Typically, I do not rely upon x-rays, but rather on the pathologist's description. Well, that's different because Dr. McCarthy took it upon himself to review the x-rays and make his own determinations, even though he's not a doctor, only a mechanical engineer. So there's that. This guy says, no, I don't look at x-rays. Or I don't rely on them. Not that he doesn't look at them, but he doesn't use what he sees from them to make his final conclusions. Based upon the description of the pathologist, are you aware that she had some severe fractures to the left leg? I could review the copy of the autopsy protocol at this point and refresh my recollection as to that. Well, assuming that she had fractures to the left leg, which appear in x rays, and assuming 168 is one of those x rays of her left leg, would you agree that it's unlikely that Kitty Menendez could have been standing after she received that shot to her left leg? Based upon what appears to be a complete fracture of the femur in this photograph, I would believe that she couldn't remain standing, placing weight on that leg. No. So, does that help you at all? May I complete my? Yes. In order to remain standing, she would have to have her weight on the other leg if it is not similarly injured. So she could still be standing on her other leg, he says. And you use the term likely and unlikely at various times during the course of your testimony, haven't you, sir? Yes, I have. Can you tell how likely it is that you think that this woman was standing there while shot after shot was being inflicted upon her body? Objection, Your Honor, vague. Do you understand the question? The witness says, yes, I understand what he means. You want me to go ahead? Yes, the court says. It's a difficult question to answer because there's additional factors not included in your question to consider, and that is how rapidly the shots occurred to her. There would be some discrete time for her to react to a shot. So, if the shots were spaced out over a long period of time, I would consider the likelihood of her remaining standing during the entire time to be less than if the shots occurred rapidly. That makes sense. If the shots are occurring rapidly and she could be standing, but it's only seconds, she's only standing for a few seconds to receive another shot or milliseconds. And that's what he's saying. And that makes sense. Did you form any opinion as to how many shots she might have received before she fell to the floor? No, I wasn't able to form any opinions as to whether or not the shots were received standing, or which portion of them were received standing, or which portion were received after she was already on the floor. Okay. Now, in regard to the blood that was observed on the sole of the shoe of Kitty Menendez, I'm referring to the right shoe. Could that blood have gotten there as a result of let's see, if I can find the photograph. Let me direct your attention here to 332, which is a close-up showing the floor around the feet of Kitty Menendez. Could that blood to the right shoe of Kitty Menendez have gotten there from any of these spots that appear near her shoe? Blood on her right shoe, are we talking about? Well, how many drops of blood did she have to the right shoe? Oh, I don't know how many drops there were. There was at least smeared blood. I'd have to look. I have a photo here. There was at least one large area that appeared to be a drop on the top of the shoe. The rest of the blood that's visible to me in this photograph, and that is not drop blood, but rather contact transfer. Which part of her shoe was that stain found? Which? Which part of her shoe? Which stain found? The one you're referring to that was a contact transfer. There's a contact transfer visible on the back surface of the shoe, also visible on the side of the shoe closer to the front and on the sole. Are you referring to this here on the back of the shoe? That's the portion of the blood I'm referring to. There's more. Could you tell us how that could have gotten there? By contact with an area of wet blood. From the appearance of the stain as it is contiguous with the contact transfer on the back of her leg, it would appear that it was probably from the same contiguous source, that the leg and the shoe contacted blood source at the same time. What are the various sources from which that might have been obtained from? The floor or some other bloodied portion of her clothing would be most likely. Okay. Just by looking at the stains to her shoe, you can't tell that she was necessarily standing when she received the stains to the bottom of the shoe, rather than laying on her back and having the sole of her shoe pressed against the floor. Is that correct? That is correct. I can only tell that the legs themselves were in an upright position. Well, at that point, I can only tell that the shoes of the soles of the shoes were down to contact the bloody area. Now, you think that counsel also had you testify to the fact that there were some drops. Not only were there drops of blood which were found down by the feet of Kitty Menendez, but that there were also drops of blood found up here in the upper part of Kitty Menendez. Is that correct? Are we talking about the ones that appear on the tabletop? Yes. Well, there are some found on the floor. Is that correct? Again, it's impossible for me to remember every drop. I would have to review it again to address that. Okay, let me direct your attention to 96. This photograph shows Kitty Menendez and the top portion of the coffee table. You were testifying in regard to the spatter that you see in that area. I hadn't previously, but well, do you see spatter in that area? On the floor at the end of the coffee table? Yes, I do. Okay. And do you also see spatter on the coffee table itself? Yes, I do, on papers on top of the coffee table. By looking at the spatter both on the papers on the floor as well as the spatter on the coffee table, can you determine the direction of the travel of that spatter? I can determine the direction of travel of many of the drops with respect to the surface that they appear on. The complication is that most of those drops fall on loose papers that are themselves movable, and that makes it unreliable to determine the direction of travel at the time they were deposited relative to more fixed objects such as the table. In other words, the papers could have been in a different position, so while I can determine the direction relative to the object that it's on, I can't necessarily determine the direction of travel with respect to the floor. Okay, well, you have no evidence before you at this time that those papers were moved from the time of the shooting to the time that the photographs were taken. Is that correct? I really don't know at what point they were moved. Well, assuming for a moment that those papers were not moved from the time of the shooting to the time that the photograph was taken, would you be able to give an indication as to the direction of travel of the blood spatter? Objection, Your Honor. Improper hypothetical. Overruled. Yes, I can form some opinions with regard to that. Perhaps we could put that on the board and you can tell the jury what your opinion is concerning the travel of the blood spatter. Let me give you the pen once again, directing your attention both to the spatter on the papers here and to the spatter that appears on the coffee table. Can you please tell us what the direction of travel is? Perhaps you can make an arrow and indicate. Okay. The totality of the pattern on the papers on the floor, with respect to the floor itself, as it appears in this photograph, is traveling generally in trying to find a place to mark. It's just, I'll just mark over the paper. It's in this direction to the table, drops on the table. There's actually at least two events that lead to the deposit of blood on these papers, and certain of the drops are traveling in this direction. And although I only have a partial view of the appearance of this larger drop here, that is, it is traveling in that direction at the time relative to the paper at the time it was applied. All right, thank you. Now, do those arrows indicate or signify the direction of the shot, or do those arrows simply signify that however the shot struck the victim, the blood spattered in that direction? Well, I can't even conclude that those are directly spatters from the gunshots. They could be spattered from other activities, such as movement of the decedents after the shooting had began while they were still mobile. So it would be unfair for me to attempt to address them all with relation to the directions of the shots, since I don't know that they are directly from the shots. They could be secondary due to bleeding and movement afterwards. I see. So what you're saying is that the victims themselves, after they had been shot, they might have moved their arm and, for example, flicked their own blood? That's certainly a possibility. This is a hypothetical. Assuming those blood spatters represent spatter from the shot itself, would that indicate to you the direction that the shot was fired, or simply that whatever direction the shot was fired, blood spurted away from the victim in that direction? Well, I really am unwilling to conclude that those are directly from the shots, and being on movable objects, unwilling to conclude that the papers were in those positions originally. There's a lot of uncertainty to conclude that. Thank you. I have no further questions. The court says anything else? Briefly, Your Honor, so we're going to have some redirect. Ms. Abramson asks, if I understand you, Mr. Linhart, you're saying you don't know if those papers were on the floor at the time that the blood was connected with them, or whether they were on the table or somewhere else? I really can't tell. And nobody else could tell either looking at that, could they? I don't think reliably, no. I just want to go back to, you said you have the 1989 coroner's protocol in front of you. I believe you had started to read about wound number 1 to Mrs. Menendez, and then you were asked some questions before you finished. I would invite you, sir, to look at page 3 of the Mary L. Menendez protocol of 1989. If you want to read the complete description of wound number 1, the first 2 sentences referring to it are at the very bottom of the page, number 2, and I would invite you, Mr. Linhart, to read through the entire description before I ask you any questions. All right, I'll take a moment. Thank you, sir. The witness reads it and says, all right. And do you know, Mr. Linhart, that Dr. Golden, in trying to find the wound path for this wound, the contact wound, indicates that it is contiguous to 2 other head wounds that Mrs. Menendez sustained? Yes, I did note that he described that. And did you also note that he said he cannot distinguish the 3 wound tracks from each other? Objection misstates the report. The court says, why don't you read that particular portion? After describing how these 3 wounds are close to and contiguous to each other, does Dr. Golden say, hence, all the 3 cannot be exactly distinguished? Yes, this is a direct quote from his autopsy protocol. And in the next paragraph, when he makes this statement, quote, there is hemorrhaging along the entire wound path as described, and in the case of gunshot wound number 1, dark blood soot deposit admixed with the bone fragments. Is he describing the unified wound path? Objection, the document speaks for itself. Overruled. I would have to refer to Dr. Golden to describe that. Had I required that information for my reconstruction, I would have had to have clarified those issues. And he does not clarify in his report whether he was able to separate the 3 wound paths or to determine which of the 3 injury areas to her head caused the wound path or caused the hemorrhaging that he sees. Objection argumentative. The document speaks for itself. Overruled. No, I don't see where that's clarified. Okay, now I would like to show you the 1995 supplement and ask you, first of all, to turn back to page 3, which we have, and count down to paragraph 5. And paragraph 5 begins with the word opinion. That's correct. Do you see in the 1995 supplement where Dr. Golden, referring to that paragraph, indicates that the following should be added to his opinion about wound number 1? So this is the amendment. This is being added to his opinion. Quote, due to lack of reaction, parenthesis, hemorrhage, close parenthesis, the wound appears perimortem or possibly postmortem. So due to lack of hemorrhage, it appears to be perimortem or postmortem, possibly. Yes, I see that written on the document. And does that description of lack of reaction and the change in opinion to perimortem or postmortem, is that consistent with what you saw on the external evidence of the wound? Objection misstates the testimony that it was a change from perimortem to postmortem. Overruled. What would you call it? That is consistent with my initial impression of that wound. He originally thought it was perimortem or postmortem, even before Dr. Golden changed his opinion in the 95 amendment. So he originally, before 1995, believed it was perimortem or postmortem. So now the doctor is more consistent with what this expert believes. The witness says that that is more consistent with my initial impression of the wound based upon just the surface observation that it appeared to be a postmortem wound. If below the surface, Dr. Golden couldn't tell that the wound path was or whether there was hemorrhaging along the wound path solely describable to wound number 1, would it be fair to say then there's nothing inconsistent inside the body that with what you've observed on the outside of the body? Objection assumes facts not in evidence. The court says, assuming that that was the state of the report, you can answer the question. The witness says, okay, let me ask you to re-ask it. I'll try to do that again. All right. If in fact I want you to assume that Dr. Golden could not state because the 3 wound tracks commingled that there was in fact any hemorrhaging along the wound path of the injury that we're talking about, that you observed the contact wound onto the cheek, if he cannot say there's hemorrhaging along that wound path and he has changed his opinion from antemortem or postmortem based on the appearance of the wound, is that consistent with your opinion based on the appearance of the external wound? Yes. I would assess that as a consistent finding with my initial observations as to the surface characteristics of the wound. Now, let me call your attention to the autopsy protocol for it says Joseph, but it is Jose Menendez, page 7 of that 1989 protocol. Are you familiar with Dr. Golden's description of the interior of that wound? So I just want to point out their own report says Joseph when his name is Jose. So they can't even get the decedent's name right. And we're supposed to trust everything in this report. Okay, got it. Anyways, are you familiar with Dr. Golden's description of the interior of that wound? I should reread it at this moment to refresh my recollection, if I might. Please do. We're talking about number 5, shotgun wound of the left thigh. The left thigh wounds that we can see that we've been looking at in all these photographs. The witness reads, all right, I've completed reading. And based on that description, and also based on your observations, does it appear there's only one wound track through the left leg of Mr. Menendez? That's all he describes. He describes 1 or 2 satellite entry wounds adjacent to it. He calls them, I believe, superficial, the 2 satellite pellet wound defects, he says. Yes, right. Now, he appears to be describing that as a single gunshot wound. And there's only one wound path that he describes in the autopsy report? That's correct. And he didn't indicate there's any confusion or commingling of that wound path with any other? Not that I see, no. But he does he not, describe this wound path in part with the following sentence, quote, there is hemorrhaging along the entire wound path. Yes, he does describe it as such. I have nothing further. Mr. Khan says, nothing further. The court says, okay, you may step down. You're excused. We'll take our recess. Who's the next witness? Excuse me, my next witness is Mr. Morton, Your Honor. Court says, we'll take a recess until 3. Don't form any final opinions about it, and we'll resume at 3. Ms. Abramson says, there is a matter we'd like to take up with the court. The court says, okay, we'll stay in session for that. All right, so the jury has left. And the court says the jurors have left. You said there was a matter you wanted to take up. Ms. Abramson says, it's a matter of discovery, Your Honor. Mr. Khan incorporated into a question or made a comment while this witness was on the stand that he intends to prove certain things, and we would like to have notice of what witnesses he intends to call to prove these things because there are no medical. The court says it has to do with the body tissue. Ms. Abramson says, we have no notice of any new witnesses. The court says, was that the item that you referred to? That was when he made the remark, yes. He also asked a series of hypotheticals for which there is no medical support. Okay. Well, first of all, as to the description of body tissue, Mr. Khan, Mr. Khan says, yes. That's based upon I inquired of Detective Zoller further what he meant by tissue when he described tissue, and he indicated to me that that's what he observed that night. So he will clarify his testimony. I don't think that clarification was necessary prior to the time that I think it was Dr. Fackler who began to say that tissue could mean hair or tissue could also mean bone because that is technically tissue. Detective Zoller did not mean hair or tissue. Uh, tissue is the word that he used, but he did not mean hair or bone, I think he meant to say. He was referring to what the ordinary person refers to by the use of the term tissue. Muscle? Tendon? Like what? There's tons of different types of tissue. What's the normal ordinary thing that people refer to as tissue? Your cells are tissue. Like all of it is tissue. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I have to note for the record that I believe Mr. Khan has committed misconduct. Oh, I believe Mr. Khan has committed misconduct in asking a witness specifically after the court inquired repeatedly or requested repeatedly Mr. Khan be specific about what he meant by tissue, and then Mr. Khan asked the question as if it were muscle. Now, much as I admire Detective Zoller, does she? Do you think she does? He is not a medical expert and cannot offer an opinion that that was muscle as compared to anything else. And I think it was extremely deceptive of Mr. Khan to suggest in front of the jury that there was some kind of medical support for the specific description of that material as a particular part of the human anatomy, to wit, muscle, or even the court cuts her off and says, we're arguing about something that hasn't occurred, and we don't know exactly what Detective Zoller's testimony would be. Ms. Abramson says, well, what occurred is he asked a hypothetical, and I kept objecting to it. The court asked him to be specific. He said muscle. Obviously, Detective Zoller is not qualified to offer that opinion, and it was never tested, so we can't be sure. Court says, that hasn't occurred yet. We haven't heard what Detective Zoller has to say. If he is going to offer further testimony on that subject, perhaps he can write a little report indicating exactly what it is that he would say. Ms. Abramson says, yes, that would be very useful, Your Honor. Thank you. We'll recess until 3. So the court needed to, or the court decided to say to solve that, Detective Zoller can just write a little report. Just write up a little report and say what you're going to be saying about that tissue, and then she can further argue whether it's appropriate or not. And I think that's an appropriate solution for now. All right, so that is the conclusion of criminalist Ron Linhart for the defense. And we will continue on part 20 with Dr. Morton, who, Dr. Morton, I believe, is a pathologist. Yes, he's a criminal and forensic pathologist. So we will get to him in part 20. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you. Please hit the like button if you haven't done so already, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye now.